Okay, wow. Well, we hope you've got some really great insight into our strategy for 2022 and beyond. And I think now this session is all about helping you as leaders of our fine institutions to help you focus on your strategy. So when we were considering our program leadership conference planning, we were inspired to focus on all of you, frankly. So we know that being leaders in an evolving environment is really challenging. We all experience it every day. And I think that our next speaker is not going to fall short on our desire to help you focus there. So in her new book, The Long Game, best-selling author Dorie Clark speaks to the courage and the discipline and the focus it takes to be resilient, stay relevant, and win, while really remaining brave and true, even when tempted to react to a very dynamic world order. Dorie's been named one of the top 50 business thinkers in the world by Thinkers 50. And she was honored as the #1 communication coach by the Goldsmith, Leading Global Coaches Award. She's one of the top 5 communication professionals in the world that has been recognized by global gurus. And she's a keynote speaker and teaches at Duke University's Fuqua School of Business, as well as Columbia Business School. She is the Wall Street Journal best-selling author of The Long Game, Entrepreneurial You, Reinventing You, and Stand Out, which was named the #1 leadership book of the year by INC Magazine. A former presidential campaign spokeswoman, Dorie has been described by the New York Times as an expert in self-reinvention and helping others make changes in their lives. She's a frequent contributor to the Harvard Business Review. She consults and speaks for clients at Google, Yale University, and the World Bank. Forbes has declared that her insights connect marketing, social media, communications, learning technologies, and personal discovery to give us a blueprint for success in the future economy. She's a graduate of Harvard Divinity School, a producer of a multiple Grammy-winning jazz album, and a Broadway investor. I don't know, Dorie, when I was reading all this, I was like, what else does she do? I mean, what can she do here? You can definitely download her free Long Game Strategic Thinking Self-Assessment at dorieclark.com/thelonggame. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dorie Clark to the stage. We're so excited to have
that 2020 and even 2021 did not exactly turn out the way we predicted. Now, there were some bright spots for sure. I was listening to the panel, 24% growth last year in assets under management. Props to you. That is excellent. But it's not necessarily the way that the last 2 years have played out what we anticipated. And we had to adapt in the moment. We had to. We all collectively experienced things that none of us have, even our grandparents, our great-grandparents didn't. Social distancing, moving from offices to screens, figuring out how all of that worked. For a lot of us, our lives often became a day-to-day version of this, where 17 hours of Zoom meetings in, it gets a little challenging. But we made do, and you adapted, and you moved forward in really productive ways. That was incredible. But we've done a lot of short-term thinking over the past 2 years. Now, this is actually a picture of me and my mom in March of 2020, my favorite example of positive short-term thinking. I went down, Claire mentioned I teach at Duke's Fuqua School of Business. I went down for the very last on-campus program that Duke held before the entire campus shut down in March of 2020. And my mom was starting to hear the rumbling signs. You all probably remember this. Nobody could get masks. There were masks nowhere. My mother sews, and she taught herself to sew masks by watching videos in Japanese and Chinese on YouTube. And she drove up to campus to bring me one. That was a pretty impressive example of adapting and being agile in the short term. But There's a lot of examples. We did it because we had to. Until recently, I actually just moved down to Miami, very close to here. But until recently, I lived in New York. And during the pandemic, I would walk around the streets of New York just taking photos because I was so fascinated. I was horrified by all of the pandemic and the changes, but I was also fascinated with the resiliency that people showed, that entrepreneurs and business people showed, because they had to. Like it was for you and for your clients, it's a matter of survival to figure out in the moment. As the stock market is plummeting in those early days before the incredible rebound, when people didn't know how things were going to turn out, we had to adapt. And that meant pulling some tools out of our back pocket that may have even seemed a little bit useless or irrelevant before. You probably remember, for the past 10 years, all anyone did was make fun of QR codes. What the heck is this for? It was the ultimate useless thing. A QR code, how do you get that? And now they're on menus everywhere because all of a sudden it became newly relevant. Outdoor seating, social distancing, we found a way. We had to learn to ask ourselves different questions. This was an Indian restaurant in the East Village of New York City. All of a sudden, they're not allowed to have customers indoors anymore. And so they did takeout, of course, but they also said, well, what else can I offer? What other products or services can I offer to my customers? And this is a question that you may have been asking yourself about relationships with clients. And in their case, they said, oh, well, we have a lot of food. It's all in the basement. That's what we use to make our Indian food. Let's become a grocery store too. So when people came to pick up their takeout, they could actually buy staples. You see here, they can buy rice, they can buy flour, they can buy sauces, because in that moment, what was needed was a grocery store. Another question that all of us were forced to ask, and I think it's a beneficial question for us to ask periodically, is how can I leverage the resources that I have that might be underutilized? Maybe it's personal skills or training or knowledge that you have. Maybe it's untapped time or capacity in staff that you work with or supervise. But how can I leverage resources that might be underutilized to just level up and serve our clients better? That was the question that these folks asked themselves. This was the owner of a coffee shop in a little neighborhood called Washington Heights in New York City. You may be familiar with it if you saw the Lin-Manuel Miranda movie In the Heights this past summer. Lots of bodegas, lots of little places, little locally owned businesses. And there was a coffee shop and wine bar that, because of the indoor dining prohibition, all of a sudden, they're not allowed to have people indoors either. Again, you can have takeout, that's great, but there's only so much business you can do. But the owner was an antique collector. And he said, you know what? Here's an underutilized resource. I'm not allowed to have customers dining indoors, but I can have a store. And so he moved his entire antique collection into his coffee shop. And suddenly you see the sign here. It says, we're a pastry shop, a coffee shop, a wine shop. Oh, and an antique shop too. That is an example of some of the creative thinking that we all had to do, in the ways that we summoned strength and capacity and potential that maybe for a lot of us we didn't even know we had over the past 2 years. And so short-term thinking, I am never going to come here and say it's a bad thing. It's not. Short-term thinking is exactly what we need in certain circumstances. When there's a crisis, when things are going down, we have to get good at short-term thinking and pivoting in the moment, because that is how we survive. But I would also like to suggest to you that 2 years in, now we're back. This event was not able to be held last year. 2 years later, we're finally back. And I think that it's time for all of us here, and I would even argue more broadly for people in the world, to start reshifting their thinking just a little bit. Because just as you know, it is a good thing to have a thoughtfully balanced portfolio. I think that we have been over-indexing collectively as a society on short-term thinking over the past 2 years. It served us well. It got us to a good place that we needed to be, but it's also time for us to realize that we are overweight in that part of our portfolio. And now it's time to start thinking about long-term thinking, strategic thinking, and how to bring it back. Because the problem, many of you are probably watching the Olympics right now. And we're seeing, all the stories about training and heroism and these amazingly talented individuals and teams that have been working so hard toward their goal. Now, the good news for them is they know what their goal is. They know where they need to excel in that moment. But the problem that we need to guard against, that we have to be careful about, is that if all we do is short-term thinking, if we keep being caught in that adrenaline rush, that adrenaline rut of just moving from one thing to another without really taking a step back and looking at the broader strategic picture of where we want to go, the problem is that we may end up losing by winning. And what I mean by that, when I was interviewing folks for my most recent book that Claire was alluding to, The Long Game, I talked to a colleague of mine, and he's a futurist named Jonathan Brill, and he told me something that stayed with me. He said, if you have a group of smart, talented, competent, capable people, the worst thing you can do is to tell them to win at the wrong thing, because they will do it. And then you get to the end of the road of all of that hard work, only to realize that we have been optimizing for the wrong outcome. What I want for all of you and for all of us is to make sure, after all of the pivoting and the agility and the movement of the past couple of years, that we take a moment, that we take a breath. And I will argue that this gathering may be an excellent opportunity, a chance to meet new people, to connect with colleagues, to see people you haven't seen in 2 years, to refresh your social networks that, like a lot of us, may have atrophied over the Zoom screen for the past 2 years, to maybe take that step back and say, where do we want to go? What are the conscious choices that we want to be making? Where do we want to optimize to get where you want your business and your career to go? That's really the question. That's the function of strategic thinking. And I have really become an advocate over the years of strategic thinking. Part of what inspired me to want to write a book about it, I was asked a couple of years ago to speak at a conference in Vienna about strategic thinking. That was the very broad topic that they gave me. And I was thinking about, well, what can I say? Where can I go with this? And one of the things that I realized as I was trying to explore what I could talk about, where I could add value in the somewhat well-trod topic of strategic thinking, is what I realized is there's almost no one that thinks that strategic thinking is a bad idea, right? I mean, for most concepts, for most ideas, there's fans and there's detractors, right? There's pro and there's con. For strategic thinking, not really. There's almost no one that would say it's a bad thing. In fact, there was a study done a few years ago by an organization called the Management Research Group. 10,000 senior executives they surveyed. 97% of them said the single most important thing they could do in order to actually be effective at their jobs and move their company and its goals forward was long-term strategic thinking. They all agree. But the part that I thought was fascinating was that in a separate study that was conducted just around the same time, 96% of leaders said they didn't have time for strategic thinking. They weren't doing it. What I want to suggest to you is that there is a huge competitive advantage in being the person that actually does it, that actually does what we all think is a good idea. And so in writing my book, The Long Game, I wanted to lay out ideas, strategies, ways to hopefully make it easier so that we could all start putting that lens on how we see the world. There's a pull towards short-term thinking. And again, sometimes it's good, sometimes it's necessary. During a pandemic, yes, absolutely. But also part of the problem is that human nature, we all know this, human nature is tilted toward short-term thinking. It's tilted toward, oh, well, that donut looks very delicious, doesn't it? And it's hard sometimes to take the longer view, but it's not impossible. And if we can train ourselves in small ways to look at the world just slightly differently, to hold some of these things in tension, that we need to start thinking short-term and long-term. That is how we actually can become extraordinarily powerful and effective at what we do. So I wanted to take a few moments while we're here to share with you 5 of my favorite strategies that I lay out in The Long Game in hopes that they might be helpful to you. Now, you're going to hear a lot over the course of this gathering, and there's a lot of information that's going to be thrown at you, coming at you. I want to suggest you don't have to do all of it. But if you can find even one idea in this talk or in the talks and sessions that you'll be experiencing during this conference, that can become incredibly powerful. It's like Warren Buffett, right? He says his investing strategy is one of sloth. He says that ultimately you only need to make a few good decisions in your life, but to be ready to see them. And so my suggestion for you, we only need to make a few good decisions, a few good strategic decisions. But if any of these resonate with you, if any of these are things that you say, you know, I could try that, I could do that, that seems interesting, that resonates with me, maybe it's worth giving it a try. So the first one is whitespace. Some of you may be familiar with David Allen. He is the author of the book Getting Things Done. If you're like me, a little bit of a productivity geek, you've probably read it. 2 million copies of this book have been sold. It's a bit of a productivity juggernaut. And for a previous book that I wrote called Stand Out, I interviewed David Allen. And I talked to him about this question. And what he told me has stayed with me ever since. He said, it's not that it takes a huge amount of time in order to have some brilliant breakthrough idea. He says, time is not what's relevant. He says, what it takes is space. It takes mental space. And that is what is in such short supply in our modern era. And I think we can probably all agree. I mean, in a literal sense, if we looked at your calendar, whether it's a date book or an online calendar, there's probably not a lot of white space. There's probably a lot of back-to-back meetings. It's very hard to do deeper thinking, longer-term thinking under those circumstances. But also, metaphorically, white space is really just the ability to step back and to look at things a little bit outside of the rush of the hurly-burly. And so I want to share with you 4 questions that I like to ask myself that I hope might be helpful to you. We all probably appreciate, at least in certain contexts, the value of checklists, right? We know if a pilot is flying our plane, we would like him or her to be using a checklist. That is an excellent idea. Same goes for the surgeon that is going to be operating on us. Yeah, oh, left leg? Yes, okay, good. A checklist can be powerful. But for a lot of us, sometimes what prevents us from having white space is that we actually are oftentimes too quick to say yes in our day, in our calendar, to things that maybe we shouldn't. We have to guard our space and our time for the more meaningful projects, because no one else will do it for you. It is in everyone else's interest, quite frankly, for you to be at their beck and call and for you to respond to their email in 30 seconds. That's actually handier for them. But what's handier for you in terms of building the kind of career that you want, in terms of building the kind of business and serving your clients the way you ultimately want, is to be focusing on the right things, not the distractions. To take the smaller things and put them in their place. Do them if they need to be done, but they don't have to interrupt everything. And so the 4 questions that I like to ask when I'm faced with a request, a commitment. Number 1, what is the total cost? It is really easy for us to con ourselves sometimes into thinking, oh, I can do that. Well, that'll just take 15 minutes. Oh, he wants to meet. Well, it's a half an hour. Those things add up. And the battle is won at the margins. Number 2, what is the physical and emotional cost of saying yes? A lot of us, frankly, are a little bit run down after the past 2 years. We have had a series of things that we have been called upon to do that people have not done before. Maybe you've come out of a circumstance where you've been working with the entire family. Maybe you have not had the opportunity to have things done in the way that you're used to. Maybe there's new protocols. Maybe there's new remote/hybrid settings. Who knows? Everybody's situation is different in the particulars, but the level of stress and change that it has engendered is relatively consistent for most people. Sometimes we need to cut ourselves a little bit of slack because we realize this is a different time and it takes a little while to recover from all of that. Third, what is the opportunity cost? This is actually a big deal because we often think in our heads, oh, well, should I do this or should I not do this? Actually, that is the wrong question. The question is, should I do this request or should I do literally anything else in the world that would take this same amount of time? Because our lives are one thing. Our lives are finite. And that is actually the trade-off that we're making. And number 4, one of my favorites, how will I feel about this in a year? If it doesn't really matter, if you literally won't even remember it in a year, then maybe it doesn't need to be done. But being just a little bit more acute with our filters helps us win the battle about our time. No one else will protect it but us. And I would like to suggest, this is not about, oh, get back 10 hours of your week. I know you guys are working so hard and you are already optimizing nearly as much as you can, probably. But I will also say, you can probably win back an hour. And even an hour a week can sometimes make a difference between feeling busy and feeling overwhelmed, between feeling busy and feeling like you're not able to accomplish what you want to. And if we can just dial back enough to get back to our sweet spot, that makes a big difference. Now, the second strategy that I wanted to share with you, I love this one because it sounds very counterintuitive. It even freaks some people out, and I think that's a good thing. And that is, decide what to be bad at. This actually comes from research by a couple of colleagues of mine, Frances Frye, who's a professor at Harvard Business School, and her partner and co-author, Ann Morris. They wrote a book a few years ago called Uncommon Service. And in it, they described the success secrets of a variety of service businesses. And they were trying to answer the question, which, frankly, most of us have probably wondered about over the years, which is, why are so many businesses really profoundly average? Why is it so hard for a company to be great? Everyone wants to be great, obviously. Why are so few great? And what they discovered, I thought, was quite powerful. Not just for our businesses, but for our lives, for our careers. What they discovered is that the biggest problem is that the reason the companies were average is they refused to choose what to be bad at? Let me explain. They gave, as just one of many examples, a particular bank that they studied. Now, this bank was very popular. This bank was loved by its customers. It was actually one of the positive examples. Part of why, big part of why, it was loved by its customers was it was open until 8 o'clock every weekday. Who wouldn't love that? That was extremely convenient. If you needed to stop by the bank after work, you could go do it. So it was a hit. Now why, of course, this begs the question, why doesn't everyone do that? If it's so popular, why wouldn't every single bank do it? Well, we probably know the answer, which is it's expensive. They didn't want to spend the money. But this particular bank said, we will make a choice. And the choice is this. The money has to come from somewhere, so we are going to take the interest rates that we pay on deposits, and we are going to make them basically nothing. And they brought those numbers down, and it gave them the money so they could keep the branches open late. Now, if you asked a customer, hey, would you love it if your bank took the interest that they paid and took it basically down to zero? I mean, no customer is going to say, oh yeah, do that. That sounds fantastic, right? But the truth was, for the particular customers that this bank served, they didn't really care. They didn't really notice. They didn't really care. What they cared about was the hours. And so they loved their bank. There are trade-offs everywhere. And so one of the questions for all of us to be asking, just maybe, in the back of your mind, throughout the course of this gathering, just in general, what are those things that maybe you're doing for your customers, your clients, that they don't really need, they don't really care about? And how could you take that and perhaps refocus some of that into the things that they would really notice, that they would really care about? If we can just get sharp about asking that question on an ongoing basis, how do we really over-deliver? How do we over-index on the metrics that truly matter to them? That is a really powerful question. And it doesn't mean that we have to do everything, because guess what? No one can do everything. We understand that. You have to make trade-offs somewhere. But if you can make smart trade-offs so that you're over-indexing where it counts, you're under-indexing where they don't even notice, then it's not such a bad thing. That's number 2. Number 3, which I think especially during this past 2 years of pandemic and post-pandemic asterisk question mark, we don't know how long this is all going to spin out, right, is a topic that I talk about in the long game, which is called heads up and heads down mode. Now, it is important for all of us. For all of you, I am sure part of what has made you successful and great at your jobs is being focused, being hard charging, getting the job done. That's amazing. That is a good thing. I also know that there are different personality types that people have, right? And you probably identify with one of these. There are some people that are kind of heads up type people, right? They are constantly looking around for ideas, for opportunities. They love meeting people. They love new thing, new shiny new object. Oh, we could do this, we could do that. Oh, I could, try this, meet this person. They are exciting people to be around because they are always heads up looking for the next thing. There's also a different type of person. There's the heads down person that is really into the execution, getting it done, focus, plowing through. All right, we're going to make it happen. We're going to get it done. That's essential. That's really important, especially over the past couple of years. Probably a lot of us, whether it's our natural personality type or not, probably were forced into really over-indexing on heads down mode. But one of the things that I realized in the course of the research that I've done around strategy is that strategy is not a permanent state of affairs, right? The conditions on the ground change. Now, it doesn't mean we change our strategy every week. That's not the point. But it's also true that we can't set our strategy once and then forget it. oh, well, that's going to be the strategy forever. No, we need to adapt. We need to think cyclically. There's a book that came out 20 years ago, kind of classic in the business field, called The Power of Full Engagement by Tony Schwartz and Jim Lohr. Jim Lohr actually was based not too far from here. He was a famous sports coach. He got his start in the world of tennis. And one of the things that he discovered, which was true certainly of elite tennis players and elite athletes, and more broadly they realized was true for executives, is that you cannot keep going at full throttle all the time. It literally does not work as a human animal. What we need to do in order to optimize our performance, and this is true of both physical performance and mental performance, is we need to think of ourselves, to think of our energy, to think of the work we do cyclically, as times when we're going all in and full throttle, and then times when we step back and rest a little bit and recharge a little bit. We can't get away with doing the same thing at the same intensity all the time. We have to realize that there are cycles, and if we want to be successful, we need to navigate them. And so I will suggest for all of us that if you've been in a lot of heads down mode, maybe it's time to lift your head up a little bit and reevaluate your strategy, whether it's for the business, whether it's for you and your career, and vice versa. If you've been heads upping, maybe it's time to drill down with some of those amazing ideas that you have been discovering and pick one, pick two, and execute. But it's about doing both. If we can do both and learn to ride the waves, to ride the cycles, that's part of how we can become exceptionally good at what we do and make it sustainable. Number 4, the deception phase. One of the insights that I've come across in my research over the past few years that I thought was especially interesting was some work that was done out of Silicon Valley. There were a couple of books written by a pair of authors, Peter Diamandis and Stephen Kotler. They were called Bold and Abundance. And it was a series of books where they were talking about what they called exponential technology. Now, exponential technology, as they define it, is basically anything, any technical advancement that is growing at this exponential rate. So they would include things like AI, self-driving cars, 3D printing, even, I mean, now it's fairly evolved, but back in the day, they would even call digital photography an exponential technology, right? And so these things developed. And what was very interesting, as they described it, is that there are predictable stages of growth when it comes to exponential technology. One of them, the one that I thought was most fascinating, is called the deception phase. And the reason it's called the deception phase is that we all probably intuit this, right? At a certain point, there's a lot of hype around these technologies. It's like, oh, it's going to be the next thing. Oh, self-driving cars. All the truck drivers in America are going to be fired in the next 2 years because everything's going to be self-driving, right? And then, of course, we see, no, that's not going to happen. And so there's cycles. And people say, well, that's ridiculous. This is so overblown. People are just exaggerating. There's nothing to it. And so it gets dismissed. And when it's dismissed, this is what they call the deception phase. Because to an outside observer, it looks like you're not making any progress at all. You say, you know what? I've been hearing about AI for 20 years. Come on, show me the money. Nothing's happening. But the truth is, under the surface, it's been doubling all along. If we think about it in the realm of digital photography, it's probably the easiest to envision. You think about the pixels and the crispness of the image. You start out 0.01, 0.02, 0.04, 0.08. You look at it as an outside observer, you're like, that all looks like 0. And it is. It is basically 0. But the truth is it's been growing. But when the progress reaches what the scientists call the whole number barrier. All of a sudden it goes from these tiny numbers to 1, and then it's 2, and 2, and then it's 4, and 4, and then it's 16. All of a sudden, that is when the world clues in and says, whoa, where did that come from? And they are stunned by its progress, even though it's been brewing under the surface all along. What I would like to suggest to you is that this pattern, this phenomenon, is not just true in science and scientific advances. It's not just true in Silicon Valley. It's actually true in our own lives and in our own careers. Because I am willing to bet that whether it's now or at some point in your professional life, there have probably been initiatives, ideas, programs, something that you wanted to do, something you wanted to explore, something you wanted to try, a new area you wanted to get into, and other people just didn't see it. And in those times, it can become really hard to persist. It can feel very lonely in that moment. It's like you're going through this tunnel and you feel like it's promising, but you're not getting much validation. Everybody else is raising questions, and you don't even know for sure. It's like painters. Picasso, he was successful from his early 20s. Everybody said he was a genius. Well, that's nice. That's nice for him, right? Very empowering. Meanwhile, Cézanne, who is recognized by history as being one of the most important painters ever, it was not until his late 40s that anyone saw any promise in his work. It is incredibly hard to go through that tunnel and to have no validation, to just not, to think it can work, to believe in it, but to not know for sure. But for many of us, as we are emerging from the last 2 years of unpredictability, uncertainty, rapid changes, all of the things that we have had to contend with, there may be directions that you want to explore, things you want to try, initiatives you want to launch, things that you want to learn or get into, professional development you want to do for yourself. Others may not see it. They may not see the value. And this is the place where a lot of people, unfortunately, drop off, understandably, because they get discouraged. But I want to suggest to you that the deception phase is a powerful place, because if you can push through, if you can get past that, it actually is often what enables you to separate yourself from the competition, because other people are not willing to go through that tunnel. They're not willing to endure the skepticism or to try something that is not a sure thing. If it were a sure thing, obviously everyone would do it. But it's the people who are willing to try something, to learn, to test. This is not about wantonly going into something, putting all your chips on, red 7, but it's about taking smart bets. It's about trusting yourself enough to say, well, let's see where this goes, and let's keep monitoring the progress, because it could turn into something. My final point that I wanted to raise with regard to this, because there's the obvious question, if you're in the deception phase, if you're moving toward something, if you're trying to move an idea, an initiative forward, maybe you want to be breaking in to serve different types of clients, maybe you want to be offering something slightly different, using new technologies, doing things in a slightly different way, may not necessarily be easy. But one of the most powerful things that we can do is what I call watching for the raindrops. Because so often, the way that we frame success, the way that the world frames success, is that it's all about the final home run. It's about being on the magazine cover. It's about landing the massive deal. It's about the thing that is the definitive proof of victory. And that is fantastic. That is very sweet. But it can take a while. And one of the hardest parts about strategic thinking and maintaining a strategic mindset is that we have to be willing to endure that period of uncertainty as we progress. That is how long-term, meaningful goals actually get accomplished. And so it takes a while before everything comes to fruition and there's the giant thunderstorm that no one can deny. But in the interim, there are signs. There are telltale signs. I call them raindrops. And it may be small. It may be getting a note from your boss saying, or from a client expressing gratitude about something that you've helped them do. It may be starting to get interesting new inbound inquiries because people are starting to hear about your approach and what you're doing. It may be getting peers and colleagues who all of a sudden are reaching out. Maybe more people are connecting with you on LinkedIn or what have you because they're starting to hear a little buzz. You're doing something different. You're doing something valuable. All of a sudden, you're gaining traction that they're picking up on. Those are things that are small, subtle signs. They are easy to dismiss, but what they are is they are the breadcrumbs that track the progress that you are making. And as we think about how to get through the deception phase and how to actually reap the promise of long-term thinking, watching for the raindrops and being aware of looking for those signs and recognizing them for what they are can be very powerful. We've been talking about long-term thinking and how to balance it with the exigencies of today. You have done an amazing job over the past 2 years of pivoting, being agile, serving your clients during a complicated time. Going from the lows and the fears of March 2020 to the amazing bull market, and more recently, some of the jitters. You've gone through all of that with your clients. And I think that one of the most important points that I would like to leave you with throughout as you're going through the rest of this time together is the question, how will you balance long and short term? There's a term that actually the poet John Keats created called negative capability. And what it refers to is being able to hold two seemingly contradictory things in your mind at the same time. He said, if you have that ability, that is the sign of a developed mind. It's both and. There's not a thing wrong with short-term thinking. It is a valuable tool in our arsenal, but it can't be the only thing that we do. We need long-term thinking, and I would argue we need long-term thinking now, perhaps more than we ever have, because we've come from such a disrupted period, and a period where it's been in such short supply. This is a moment, as LPL has convened us, to be able to take that step back from the day-to-day. You're in a new place with new people and a new context. It is a fantastic time to start asking these questions about where we really want to go and what the steps are that might get us there. It's about holding these ideas in tension. We don't have to come up with a solution right now, but over the time that we spend together, even to just have the questions circulating about how we can take the steps to put on the frame so that in our lives we can be more of a long-term thinker, I believe is one of the most powerful questions that we can all be asking ourselves. Thank you all so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back Claire McCarthy.
Okay.